The judge's gavel hadn't even fallen yet when my wife Diana leaned over to her new boyfriend and laughed. I heard every word from where I sat at the defendant's table alone. No attorney beside me, just a worn leather briefcase that had belonged to my grandfather. "Look at him," Diana whispered loud enough for half the courtroom to hear. "Too broke to even hire a lawyer. This is going to be over in 10 minutes. Her new boyfriend, Bryce Caldwell, smirked from his seat in the gallery. Bryce wore a suit that probably cost more than I'd made in the last 3 months. He was everything Diana had apparently been looking for when she decided our 12-year marriage wasn't good enough anymore. Rich, successful, connected. The kind of man who could afford the best business litigation attorney in the state. That attorney, Victoria Mansfield, sat at the plaintiff's table, shuffling through documents with the confidence of someone who'd never lost a case. She glanced at me once, taking in my off-the-rack suit and solo appearance, then dismissed me entirely. I wasn't worth her attention. The truth was, Diana hadn't always been this way. When we'd first started dating 15 years ago, she'd been drawn to my work ethic, my hands-on approach to building something from nothing. She used to visit me at the garage where I worked as a welder, bringing me coffee and admiring the precision of my metalwork. Back then, she called me her craftsman and talked about how refreshing it was to be with someone who created tangible things instead of just pushing papers around. But somewhere along the way, that admiration had curdled into embarrassment. The bigger Caldwell construction grew in our town, the more Diana seemed to notice the gap between what I provided and what men like Bryce could offer. The fancy restaurants, the country club memberships, the luxury cars. She started making little comments about expanding our horizons and thinking bigger. I thought she meant growing the business together. I was wrong. The bailiff called the court to order. Judge Margaret Sinclair entered, a woman in her 60s with steel gray hair and a reputation for no-nonsense rulings. She'd been on the bench for 30 years and had seen every trick in the book. "This is a motion for partition and sale of business property," Judge Sinclair announced, settling into her chair and reviewing the documents before her. "Mrs. Mansfield, you may proceed." Victoria Mansfield stood, and I had to admit she was impressive. She moved with practiced precision, every gesture calculated to convey authority and righteousness. Her reputation in business litigation was well earned. She'd built her career destroying small business owners who couldn't afford proper representation. Today, I was supposed to be just another notch on her expensive briefcase. "Your Honor," Mansfield began, her voice filling the courtroom, "my client, Diana Hudson, seeks her rightful share of the marital property, specifically the metalworking shop known as Hudson Fabrication. The defendant, Marcus Hudson, has refused to cooperate in the equitable distribution of this asset, which was built during their marriage using marital funds." She pulled out documents, holding them up like they were holy scriptures. "Furthermore, Your Honor, Mr. Hudson has attempted to hide the true value of this business, claiming it's worth only $180,000, when recent market analysis suggests metalworking operations of this scope typically command significantly higher valuations. He's also been operating the business without my client's consent, denying her access to financial records and excluding her from management decisions despite her substantial contributions to its development." Diana dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. I recognized the performance. She'd practiced that crying routine in front of our bathroom mirror when she was planning this whole thing. I'd come home early from work one day and caught her rehearsing her devastated wife expression in the hallway mirror. When she saw me, she'd quickly pretended she was just checking her makeup. I should have known then what was coming. "Your Honor," Mansfield continued, building momentum like a prosecutor closing on a guilty verdict. "Mr. Hudson has shown complete disregard for my client's property rights and her contributions to this business. Mrs. Hudson served as the company's financial manager for 8 years, handling bookkeeping, customer relations, and administrative duties. Her labor and expertise contributed significantly to the business's current value. We are requesting an immediate partition and sale of the business, with proceeds to be divided equally between the parties." She sat down with a satisfied smile. Partition and sale. That was her opening move. Diana was beaming from the gallery, probably already calculating how she'd spend her half of my life's work. I could see it in her eyes, the same look she got when she was shopping for things we couldn't afford, mentally redecorating our house with money we didn't have. Judge Sinclair looked at me over her reading glasses. Mr. Hudson, do you have legal representation? No, Your Honor, I'm representing myself. A ripple of whispers went through the courtroom. Diana's laugh was the loudest. It wasn't just amusement, there was genuine cruelty in it, the sound of someone who'd been waiting for this moment of public humiliation. You understand that's generally not advisable? The judge asked, her tone suggesting she'd seen this movie before and knew how it usually ended. I understand, Your Honor, but sometimes a man has to work with what he has. The words came out steadier than I felt. My palms were sweating, and I could feel every eye in the courtroom on me, measuring my chances and finding them wanting. Judge Sinclair nodded slowly. Very well. Would you like to respond to these allegations? I stood up, and the courtroom went quiet. I could feel every eye on me, Diana and Bryce watching with barely concealed amusement, Victoria Mansfield checking her watch, probably calculating how quickly this would be over so she could move on to her next appointment. The court reporter's fingers hovered over her keyboard, ready to record my inevitable fumbling response. I picked up my grandfather's briefcase, the leather worn smooth from decades of use. The brass clasps still clicked with the same satisfying precision they had 40 years ago. My grandfather had been a railroad mechanic back in the 70s and 80s, but he'd also been a union steward and had dealt with enough contract disputes to learn his way around business law. He'd passed away when I was 12, but my father had kept his legal books and had made sure to pass along the lessons. Son, in any business deal, documentation is everything. Keep records, know your rights, and never let anyone intimidate you out of what's rightfully yours. Your Honor, I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. Before we discuss partition and sale, I need to address some fundamental issues with Mrs. Mansfield's characterization of Hudson Fabrication and my wife's role in its operation. Victoria Mansfield's confident smile flickered slightly. She wasn't used to self-represented defendants who spoke in complete sentences, let alone ones who challenged her opening statements directly. The business incorporation documents dated March 15, 2016, I continued, pulling out a document from my briefcase. The papers were organized exactly the way my grandfather had taught my father, and my father had taught me, chronologically, with supporting documents clipped behind each primary filing. Your Honor, I'd like to submit these into evidence. I walked forward and handed copies to the bailiff, who distributed them to the judge and opposing counsel. My legs felt steadier than I'd expected. All those nights I'd spent in my workshop office practicing this moment were paying off. I'd rehearsed this presentation dozens of times, timing each section, anticipating objections. Mansfield frowned as she scanned the document, her perfectly manicured fingers drumming against the table. This wasn't going according to her script. As the court can see, I said, Hudson Fabrication was incorporated as a sole proprietorship under my name alone, using startup capital from the sale of my personal truck and equipment I'd purchased before our marriage. I submitted the incorporation papers, the bill of sale for my truck, a 2003 Ford F-150 that had been my pride and joy, and receipts for the welding equipment I'd bought with my bachelor savings. Every document was pristine, organized in clear plastic sleeves. Judge Sinclair studied them carefully, her experienced eye noting the meticulous preparation. The startup capital totaled $23,000, I continued. This included $15,000 from the truck sale and $8,000 worth of welding equipment purchased in 2015, 6 months before Diana and I were married. While Diana is listed as an authorized signatory for banking purposes, a decision I now regret, she holds no ownership stake in the business entity itself. Diana's face had gone pale. She was remembering now. I could see it in her expression. She remembered those early conversations about keeping the business separate, about how important it was to me to build something that was truly mine. Back then, she'd supported the idea, even encouraged it. You should be your own boss, she'd said. I believe in you. Furthermore, I continued, Mrs. Mansfield claims Diana has been excluded from business operations. The truth is somewhat different. I pulled out my phone and connected it to a small portable projector I'd brought. The court security had cleared the equipment earlier, another detail I'd researched and prepared for. With the court's permission, I displayed documents on the courtroom wall. The first image showed employment records and pay stubs, 8 years' worth of meticulous documentation. Diana has been employed by Hudson Fabrication as bookkeeper and office manager since January 2017, approximately 10 months after incorporation. She receives a salary of $32,000 annually, plus full health benefits valued at approximately $8,000 per year. The numbers were all there, clean and verifiable. As you can see from these records, she has never been denied access to financial information. In fact, she's been responsible for maintaining most of it. Every bank statement, every client invoice, every expense report. Mrs. Hudson has had full access to all of it in her capacity as office manager. Bryce shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I could see him realizing that Diana hadn't been completely honest with him about her role in the business. She'd probably painted herself as an equal partner being pushed out, not as an employee with full financial access who'd been systematically betraying her employer. What Mrs. Mansfield failed to mention, I continued, feeling the momentum building in my favor, is that Diana has been systematically undermining the business for her personal benefit and that of Mr. Caldwell. I clicked to the next slide, revealing a series of email headers and timestamps. These are communications between Diana and Bryce Caldwell, dating back 8 months, discussing what they term the strategic acquisition of Hudson Fabrication for Caldwell Construction's expansion plans. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Diana looked like she'd been slapped. I had expected this moment, prepared for it, but seeing the shock on Diana's face still hit me harder than I'd anticipated. This was the woman I'd shared a bed with for 12 years, the woman I'd trusted with every aspect of my business and personal life, the woman who'd held my hand when my father died, who'd celebrated with me when we landed our first major contract, and she'd been planning to destroy me for 8 months. I'll read from one email dated January 15th, I said, my voice carrying clearly over the growing commotion. The court reporter was working furiously to keep up. Quote, "The metalwork contracts alone are worth over $200,000 annually. If we can force a partition sale, I can coordinate with buyers to lowball the auction and pick up the assets for 60 cents on the dollar. Marcus is too trusting to see it coming and too proud to settle out of court." End quote. Victoria Mansfield was on her feet before I'd finished reading. "Your Honor, the origin and authenticity of these documents is highly questionable." "Actually," I said calmly, maintaining eye contact with Judge Sinclair, "they were retrieved from the Hudson Fabrication email server, which Diana accessed using company credentials. As office manager, all her communications were subject to company policy regarding business-related correspondence. I submitted the signed company email policy, along with IT logs showing the message traffic. The policy was something Diana had signed without really reading it, another piece of documentation that had seemed routine at the time, but proved crucial now. I'd updated our employee handbook 2 years ago after attending a small business seminar, never imagining I'd need to use it to protect myself from my own wife. Furthermore, I continued, the emails include detailed discussions about client information that Mrs. Hudson forwarded to Caldwell Construction, along with proprietary bid information that allowed them to undercut Hudson Fabrication on 3 major projects in the past 6 months. Judge Sinclair was staring at Victoria Mansfield with an expression that could freeze water. The judge had built her reputation on fairness, but she had zero tolerance for courtroom deception. I could see her mentally reassessing everything she'd heard in the opening statements. "Mrs. Mansfield," the judge said slowly, her voice dropping to that particular tone judges use when they're about to destroy someone's day. "Were you aware that your client was actively working with a third party to manipulate this litigation for their mutual financial benefit?" Mansfield stood frozen for a moment, her composure cracking like ice under pressure. This wasn't the kind of question that allowed for legal maneuvering or procedural deflection. Judge Sinclair wanted a straight answer, and everyone in the courtroom knew it. "Your Honor," Mansfield finally said, her voice losing some of its earlier authority. "My client informed me she was concerned about business management practices and her exclusion from decision-making processes. I relied on information provided by my client regarding her ownership interests and contributions to the business." "That's not what I asked," Judge Sinclair replied, her tone growing sharper. "I asked whether you knew your client was coordinating with Mr. Caldwell to manipulate this litigation. Did you investigate the business relationship between your client and Mr. Caldwell before filing this motion?" The silence in the courtroom was deafening. You could hear the air conditioning humming, the subtle creak of old wooden benches as spectators shifted uncomfortably. I watched Mansfield's face cycle through several expressions: calculation, frustration, and finally resignation. "No, Your Honor," she said quietly. "I did not investigate that relationship." "Your Honor," I said, seizing the moment, "I'd like to submit additional evidence that speaks directly to the scope of this conspiracy." I clicked to the next slide, revealing financial records I'd been saving for maximum impact. These are copies of client contracts that Diana forwarded to Caldwell Construction over the past 6 months, along with our proprietary bid information. The documents filled the projection screen: emails with PDF attachments, forwarded quotes, detailed project specifications that should never have left Hudson Fabrication's office. Each of these contracts represents work that Hudson Fabrication had been negotiating for months. Mrs. Hudson used her access to our client communications and pricing strategies to give Caldwell Construction an unfair competitive advantage. I advanced to the next slide, showing a side-by-side comparison. Here's our bid for the Riverside Shopping Center metalwork project, $47,000. Here's Caldwell's winning bid, submitted 2 days after Diana forwarded our quote, $46,500. The pattern repeats across multiple projects. The numbers told the story more clearly than any argument could. Diana was staring at the floor now, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Bryce had gone rigid in his seat, probably calculating how much legal exposure he now faced. The conspiracy wasn't just about the divorce anymore. It was about business interference, theft of trade secrets, and potentially criminal fraud. The total lost revenue from these diverted contracts is $127,000 over 6 months, I continued. Revenue that would have supported the business Diana now claims to own half of. Revenue that would have allowed me to hire additional staff, purchase new equipment, and grow the operation she's trying to destroy. I pulled out one final set of documents, the ones that had taken me weeks to compile. But the financial manipulation goes deeper than stolen contracts. These are Diana's personal financial records, which I was able to access as her spouse during our separation period. Judge Sinclair leaned forward, clearly interested in where this was heading. "Go on, Mr. Hudson." Diana has been receiving payments from Caldwell Construction that she characterized to me as occasional consulting work. I displayed bank records showing regular monthly deposits. These payments total $4,800 per month for the past 8 months. In addition to her salary from Hudson Fabrication. The payments are categorized as business development consulting, but they correlate exactly with the timeline of stolen contracts. The math was damning. Diana had been double-dipping, collecting her full salary from me while being paid by Bryce to sabotage my business. It was a level of calculated betrayal that still made my stomach turn, even after weeks of preparation. "Furthermore," I said, advancing to financial records I'd subpoenaed from Diana's personal accounts, "Mrs. Hudson has been using her access to Hudson Fabrication's business credit line to make personal purchases totaling $23,000 over the past year. These include payments to luxury retailers, spa services, and a down payment on a new vehicle, none of which were authorized business expenses." Victoria Mansfield was frantically taking notes, probably calculating how quickly she could withdraw from the case. Diana looked like she was going to be sick. Bryce was whispering urgently in her ear, but she was shaking her head, clearly in shock at how thoroughly her plan had collapsed. "Your Honor," I said, turning to face Diana directly for the first time since the hearing began. "I'm not asking this court to punish Mrs. Hudson for her personal choices regarding our marriage. People fall out of love, relationships end, and that's part of life. But what we're dealing with here isn't a marriage dispute. It's systematic business fraud conducted by an employee against her employer." Diana finally looked up at me, and for just a moment, I saw a flash of the woman I'd married. The woman who used to bring me coffee in the garage, who'd helped me paint the first Hudson Fabrication sign, who'd celebrated with me when we got our first big contract. But that woman was gone, replaced by someone who could smile while planning my destruction. I trusted her, I continued, my voice carrying the weight of genuine hurt for the first time in the hearing. I gave her access to everything: bank accounts, client lists, pricing strategies, equipment records. I brought her into the business not as an owner, but as a partner in building something together. and she used that trust to systematically destroy what we'd built. The courtroom was completely silent. Even the court reporter had stopped typing, caught up in the raw emotion of the moment. Mrs. Hudson wanted to paint me as a controlling husband denying his wife her fair share, I said, my voice growing stronger. But the evidence shows something very different. It shows an employee who violated every principle of business ethics and fiduciary responsibility. It shows someone who used intimate knowledge gained through marriage to commit what amounts to corporate espionage. I walked back to the projection setup and clicked to my final slide, a timeline showing every stolen contract, every unauthorized financial access, every coordinated bid manipulation, all mapped against Diana's email communications with Bryce. Your Honor, I'm not asking this court to award me damages, though I would be entitled to them. I'm asking the court to recognize that Hudson Fabrication was never marital property to be divided. It was my sole proprietorship that employed Mrs. Hudson until she chose to violate her employment obligations. What Mrs. Mansfield is asking this court to do is essentially reward business fraud with a 50% ownership stake in the very company that was defrauded. Judge Sinclair sat back in her chair, studying the timeline projection. The evidence was overwhelming, and we all knew it. I've been on this bench for 30 years, Judge Sinclair finally said, her voice cutting through the courtroom silence like a blade. In that time, I've seen a lot of self-represented litigants. Most of them are unprepared, emotional, and completely overwhelmed by the legal system. Mr. Hudson, you are not most self-represented litigants. She looked directly at Victoria Mansfield, and I could see the experienced attorney wince slightly. Counselor, your client's motion for partition and sale is denied. Not just denied, but denied with prejudice, meaning it cannot be refiled on the same grounds. Diana gasped audibly from the gallery, the sound sharp and desperate. Bryce had gone completely white, probably calculating his legal exposure for conspiracy and business interference. Furthermore, Judge Sinclair continued, her tone growing more severe, I'm scheduling a hearing for 2 weeks from today to address Mr. Hudson's counterclaims for business damages, theft of trade secrets, and breach of fiduciary duty. Mrs. Hudson, you will provide complete documentation of all communications with Mr. Caldwell regarding Hudson Fabrication, and you will explain to this court why your actions don't constitute tortious interference with business relations. The judge turned to me, and for the first time since entering the courtroom, her expression softened slightly. Mr. Hudson, I'm impressed by your preparation and your conduct in this courtroom. You've demonstrated that self-representation, while challenging, is not impossible when done with diligence and respect for the legal process. Thank you, Your Honor. Don't thank me yet, she said with the hint of a smile. You've still got to prove damages and navigate the counterclaim proceedings, but based on what I've seen today, I suspect you'll manage just fine. She gavelled the hearing closed with a sharp crack that seemed to echo through my chest. I packed up my grandfather's briefcase slowly, deliberately, savoring the moment. The courtroom emptied around me in a rush. Diana and Bryce practically ran for the exit, followed closely by Victoria Mansfield, who looked like she was questioning every career choice that had led to this moment. As I walked toward the courthouse exit, an older man in a well-tailored suit approached me. He had silver hair and the bearing of someone who'd spent decades in courtrooms, but unlike Mansfield, there was warmth in his eyes instead of calculation. Mr. Hudson, he said, extending his hand. George Whitfield, I'm an attorney here in town, practice business and contract law. I watched your entire hearing from the back row. We shook hands, his grip firm and respectful. I wanted to tell you, Whitfield continued, that was some of the finest advocacy I've seen in years. The way you built your case, piece by piece, never losing control of the narrative, that was masterful work. Thank you, but I just presented the facts, I replied, still somewhat stunned by how completely the hearing had gone in my favor. No, Whitfield said, shaking his head with a slight smile. You did much more than that. You told a story. You made the judge see not just the legal violations, but the human betrayal behind them. That's the art of law, not just the science. He handed me his business card, heavy stock with elegant typography. If you need co-counsel for the counterclaim hearing, I'd be honored to work with you. No charge for the consultation, just for the privilege of watching you work. I looked at the card, genuinely touched by the gesture. I appreciate that, Mr. Whitfield. I really do. Your grandfather would be proud, he said quietly. I knew him, actually. Harold Hudson, right? We worked together on a railroad union contract dispute back in the early 80s. He taught me that being successful in business isn't about winning at all costs. It's about building something honest that lasts. You learned that lesson well. 2 weeks later, the counterclaim hearing lasted less than an hour. Diana had hired a different attorney. Victoria Mansfield had withdrawn from the case, citing irreconcilable differences with the client. The real reason was probably the bar complaint I'd filed after discovering she'd submitted motions based on information she knew to be false. Diana's new attorney, a younger man named James Crawford who specialized in damage control, took one look at the evidence I'd compiled and advised immediate settlement. The agreement was straightforward. Diana forfeited any claim to Hudson Fabrication in exchange for me not pursuing criminal charges for the theft of trade secrets and business interference. The $127,000 in documented damages would be paid through garnishment of her final severance package and forfeiture of her accumulated vacation pay. As we signed the final documents, Diana looked at me with something that might have been regret. I underestimated you, she said quietly. Yes, I agreed. You did. I never knew you could do all this. The legal research, the evidence compilation, the courtroom presentation. You never asked, I replied. In 12 years of marriage, you never asked what I learned from my grandfather about running an honest business. You never asked why I kept those law books in the workshop office or why I spent time studying contract regulations. I just thought you were being paranoid about paperwork. I was being careful, I corrected. There's a difference between paranoia and preparation. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I was sitting in my expanded workshop reviewing contracts for 3 new major projects. Word had gotten around about what happened in court, and other small business owners started bringing me their fabrication work. Turns out, standing up to corporate bullying and winning is excellent advertising in the trades community. My phone rang, George Whitfield calling to check in, as he did every few weeks. How's business, Marcus? Better than ever, I said, looking around at the new equipment I'd been able to purchase with the steady revenue stream. Funny how things work out when people know you won't be pushed around. Your reputation precedes you now. That's worth more than any advertising you could buy. George and I met for lunch once a month now, sometimes talking business, sometimes just enjoying the friendship that had grown from that day in court. He'd become something of a mentor, filling part of the void left by my grandfather's absence. I never did go to law school, but I never forgot what I learned during those weeks of representing myself. The system isn't rigged against the honest business owner, not if you're willing to do the paperwork and tell the truth. Expensive attorneys can be beaten by preparation and documentation, and sometimes the best victory isn't crushing your opponent. It's just standing up for what you've built with dignity and facts. Diana and Bryce never did get married. Their relationship ended 8 months later, when she discovered he'd been using their conspiracy as a test case for larger acquisitions, planning to apply the same tactics to other small businesses. As for me, I'm still building, still learning, still honoring the lessons my grandfather passed down through my father. Every time I look at that worn leather briefcase, now displayed prominently in my office, I remember that integrity and preparation are worth more than all the money in the world.